different way. Special projects are something that I'm very interested in kind of tracking in the evolution of the art fair. And one of the things that I think represents very well our zeitgeist, or spirit of the time, is the fact that boundaries are quite blurry, and there is this new hybrid kind of model that kind of emerged, and very quickly the art fair stopped being just a place where people came and sold art. And the special project, and I want to think that the Frieze Art Fair is a really very leading in that way, has been a way to kind of understand that art can be more than just going to a booth and engaging with the art dealers. So there was this wonderful artist called Pierre Camille, who a couple of years ago created all these wonderful poncho, and the thing you had to do is you went and you pick it up, but then the rule of the rule of the game was that you had to actually wear it. You didn't have to wear it like a traditional poncho. You can actually become creative with this. So these special projects not just engage with the public in a different way, but they kind of force us to, they put us on the spot. They force us to kind of reconsider our own creativity. And I think when I look at the children in the nonprofit sections doing art, making things, and then taking them away for them, I think that's also one of the very, very important aspects of the art fair, to create this engagement with the future generation, to get the children and the young people kind of acquainted with the art, and not to feel, I would say not to feel threatened, because it's true, stepping into an art gallery or even sometimes stepping into a museum may feel very foreign or very awkward. But if you start doing it as a young age, and if you are able to engage with the student, with the children via these activities, then they will become museum goers and collectors. And I was just talking to one of my colleagues from one of the gallery, and she says, there was a little boy, he just came by, and he's 7 years old, and he says, Mother, I've seen that at Art Dubai already. And I think that's what we're trying to emulate, really. We need to think about the next generation. They'll be the one kind of nurturing the next generation of artists. So obviously the special project, the engagement with the community is so important for the success of the art fair. Traditionally, if I had been basically teaching the same class 5 or 6 years ago, and I have some of my former students, so they may still remember, I would have said, okay, the difference between the art fair and the biennales are that the art fair are purely commercial, and the biennales are more like the international exhibitions. Things are not for sales. Usually the committee is driven by nations, and it's not at all the same thing. But what I'm seeing now is a little bit more of a communication between the two. And it's also interesting to remember that the first Viennese Biennale started in the late 19th century, but it was also until the 1950s a place where you could buy the art. And I'm glad we moved away from this kind of curating. Because this idea of wall to ceiling when you cannot see art is really interesting. But it was the preferred mode of display until really the modern art gallery understood that if they wanted to convince people that Impressionism, Cubism, Fauvism was important, they could no longer display it like this. They had to display it one wall, one painting on the wall at kind of high level, and they shouldn't be crowding the walls like this. So in a way, the Venice Biennale is really the oldest, the mother of all the biennales, but at the same time, the model is now really obsolete and very, very antiquated. And I don't think anybody, even in a museum, would think about creating this kind of display unless you wanted to have a room that was very specifically historical in order for people to understand how difficult it was actually to look at painting in the 19th century. As I said, the first Biennale in Venice happened in 1895. And what's interesting about this is that, I started the talk by saying the art world was always a global place. because artists left their country to come to study in other art, in other places, very often first in Paris in the 19th century, then now in New York, but now there's so many centers. So it's always been global, and if you had been in the Biennale in 1895, the world was obviously a much smaller world, and there was very few more nations. And now this has grown so much that actually the Venice Biennale has kind of taken over the entire city with art pavilions, with places, art exhibited in churches, in palazzos, and so it's really taken over the city every 2 years. And Venice is such a city rich of history, rich of art, and I love this idea of the continuation of the Biennale since the 19th century and the dialogue between the Venetian painter of the 16th century and the contemporary artist. One of my interests as an academic is the connection between art and politics. And in a way, I started the talk also by engaging with the idea that for many governments and many nations, art was a way to kind of show how well they were doing, how healthy the country was, how in control they were of knowledge and all this kind of stuff. And it's interesting that in 1964, for the first time in the history of the Venice Biennale, it's an American artist, Robert Rauschenberg, who won the prize. Up till then, it had always been a European, and the person who won the prize before was Dubuffet, so a French artist. And that really signals, and I think it signals a watershed shift in this idea of the cultural geography. The idea that by then, 1964, the art world center was no longer in Paris, was no longer in London, was no longer in Berlin, it had moved to New York. The idea of giving the prize to an American artist is really understood as the maturity, the coming of age of the United States as not just an important nation in terms of economy and international politics, but also as a nation of culture. And in a way, that is a very important shift. And to that day, the prizes have now been awarded to not just European artists, and that continue on. So we are now waiting to see who the next, in 2 years now, who the next winner will be. And as I said, we don't really think about the Venice Biennale as a commercial space, but Yaoki Kusama, who before making this wonderful pumpkin was actually a real radical artist. She did this crazy performance in MoMA. She did this crazy performance in Central Park. She actually set up her own little mini artist as entrepreneur kind of things, and she was selling these gazing bowls, which now have become a kind of a staple of her style, for I think a couple of pounds. And she was actually helped by the Italian artist community to set up this. This was totally illegal. She was not doing this with the approval of the fair organizer. It was a little bit the artist as somebody who was there to kind of push the buttons, and she also played very much, as you can see, wearing our traditional kimono, and I always wonder, did this woman keep that bowl? Is she still? Now she has probably something that was much more valuable than the couple of dollars Kusama actually sold his work for. Kusama is, I think, a really good example of what I consider a global artist. She's able to navigate many different cultures while retaining and while understanding her own identity as a Japanese woman. And this capacity to navigate both worlds, I think, is something that is interesting and that we see more and more in our contemporary artists. A lot of them travel, they go study in other places, and when you walk the fair, you can see that while most of the art has quite a strong identity, you can see how it's been informed also by other art. So again, this idea of the art world as a place where there is a lot of communication, a lot of cooperation, and a lot of things for us to learn as part of the human race. One of the things that I think recently has been one of the interesting development of the of the art fair is what I call the idea of the rise of the star curator. So the curator is really the person with the vision and the capacity to basically, through the organization of an exhibition like a Venice Biennale or any other Biennale, being in Johannesburg or in Dakar or in Seoul or anywhere, is this idea that there is one person that has a vision, and that vision is complex, because when you ask curators, they very often talk to you about how it's very much about their own taste and how it's about meeting people and this kind of journey of discovery, going to artist studios, traveling to far places of the world, everywhere. And at that moment, what we are looking at is these few people, like Anzor, who was not the curators of this Biennale, of the Venice Biennale, but the one before, who are basically helping us sort out what's going on. And it's important that we actually have more than one voice, and it's important that actually there's more than one star curator, so we don't always have that tunnel vision. And they're really kind of helping us put order, because I think one of the challenge of the contemporary art world is, what do I do? Where do I start? How do I organize this? I see installation, I see photograph, I see people working on mixed media, I see people doing figuration, I see people doing abstraction. How can I make sense of this? It's no longer the easy way that we had in the 19th century, where you had the academic art, they follow the rules, they paint according to what the École des Beaux-Arts wants them to do, they follow what the Academy is, and then the rebellious artists, like people like Cézanne and Monet, and then eventually Picasso. This was kind of easy, you know, you had the avant-garde and you have the academic. Now, in our postmodern world, in a very transnational, global world, it's very hard to understand. So the star curators are there to give us a vision. And it's interesting to see also how their visions is connected to the idea of what's happening in the world. So for instance, when Anzor was working on the Venice Biennale to the last one, he was really, really interested in this idea of a global art world, of bringing in countries that were at the most of the time marginalized by the very Eurocentric art world. But if you see about what's happening, well, some of you hopefully had a chance to go this summer, Christine Marcel, who is part of the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris, had a totally different approach. She thought about her time period and how, you know, we live in troubled times, things are difficult in many, many ways, not just politically, but sometimes also economically. And her idea was to use art as this empowering object, as this idea that art was the celebration of life, the celebration of diversity, the celebration of humanness. And instead of taking the very political aspect that Anzor had taken 2 years ago, she was really taking that celebration. So visiting biennales is really a wonderful way to keep your pulse on what's happening in the art world. And one of the things that has been really interesting for me, and this is something that I'm trying to actually conceptualize in a much more in a better way, and I'm going to share it with you, maybe you can help me conceptualize it better, is that I think at the moment there is an extraordinary time for women artists. Women artists are becoming much more visible. You know that when you enter art school, most of the students are women. And then eventually, when you look at the records and the major retrospective, the records, let's say at auction, or the major retrospective in major museums, then women are starting to be more visible, but there's certainly no parity yet. Despite the fact that, you know, there's many women in the art world, many women artists, many women art curators and art historians like me. And I think one of the interesting aspects of the spirit of our time is the rediscovery of older women artists that are probably in their 70s and 80s now, women artists that have had actually very full careers, they were shown, they never disappeared, but they never got the visibilities that a lot of their male counterparts had. Very often these women were also married to artists, and their career took kind of second fiddle to their husband's career. So when they become widows, very much there is like a resurgence of their activities. An historical example is somebody like Sonia Delaunay, for instance. Until her husband died, Robert Delaunay, in 1942, she had decided to basically keep her practice being design, and she was working on basically creating design. She was very interested in art as life, very inspired by the avant-garde movement like the Bauhaus, for instance, or the Stil, but she didn't want to go just into paintings. When her husband died, she kind of blossomed again. A great example, of course, is somebody like Louise Bourgeois. She, moved to New York in the 40s, started creating art. She became a mother. She was the wife of a very important art historian at Columbia, and her career kind of didn't grow until her children were grown up. Unfortunately, her husband had passed away. And if you can visualize the kind of gigantic installation she was doing when she was in her 80s, it's quite amazing and very endearing and actually very inspiring. The Great Britain, the UK selected also Philia Barlow as the person to represent them. She's also an artist in her 70s. She's had a good career, but basically a little bit under the radar. So obviously this brings visibility and brings this artist back in the canon of art history. One of my favorite artists of the moment is Sheila Hicks, and you can see how gigantic that installation is with the person looking at her. She works mostly with textile and felt, which has been for a long time kind of denigrated in the art world as being a woman kind of material. But obviously things have changed, and Sheila Hicks is someone who was awarded a Ford Foundation grant in 1960. So you can imagine that she's been around for quite a while, and I think it's quite amazing to see how much her work has grown. And again, like in the fair or the Biennale, the capacity that the curator gives an artist, this idea of saying, okay, now you have an entire room, you have an entire wall. You can imagine how inspiring and empowering it is for an artist to suddenly be able to create a work that is not only going to be seen by people from all over the world, but also a work that is quite important and very large. The capacity that the biennales and large places give to the artist is quite important. This year, Mark Branford represented the United States, and he's the first African-American artist to be awarded the Pavilion, which is basically managed through the Guggenheim Foundation. And at that point, again, these spotlights are a way for countries to kind of talk about who they are and how they think about themselves as a large group of very, very different people. I think also for us, the biennales are a way to track how an artist becomes global, how an artist becomes a kind of an international star. And Ella Natsui, the African artist, is a really good example. We started seeing his work in 2007, then we saw it again 2 years later, and now his work has been collected by all the museums, from the Tate to the New Broad Museum in LA to the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris. So this idea of being able to put an artist who comes from a country that is not a gigantic art center for us is really important. So again, the idea of the visibility that these biennale bring to the artist is important. And going global, I think that's also an important thing. For instance, I think about the beginning of the Johannesburg Biennale in the late 1990s. This came just after the end of apartheid. So the idea that suddenly South Africa, that had been a country that had struggled with a lot of racial problem, was wanting to be part of the nation the inclusive nation by creating a biennale is really important. The idea that indeed the same way that a fair or a museum can bring culture and life and development to a city, the biennales are a way also for countries and cities to send a very important message to the global art community. Documenta is an interesting case, and it segues into this idea of art as a way for a country to think about its relationship with the outside world. It was created in 1955 during the Cold War in Germany, in the city of Kassel, and it was created by an art historian. And the reason for this was to bring to Germany a sense of renewal, bringing contemporary art, modern art, 10 years after the terrible trauma of the war, after not just the defeat, but the legacy of Nazism. So it helped the German people come back and be, again, full participants in this international art world and in the international world in general through the art. And the Documenta, and it's only every 5 years, but I would really encourage people to go and visit, because it's one of these exhibitions who takes usually a rather political approach to art, and it's there also to measure the pulse of the planet. So if Christine Massel tried to celebrate life through art at the Venice Biennale, usually Documenta has a little bit of a, I wouldn't say a darker side, but a side that is more about basically showing us what the things are not, what is not really going, or using the arts, and very often those are very large installation, sculptural installation that are also spread throughout the city. This year was very interesting because they decided to have half the Documenta in Kassel and half of it in Athens. And obviously this is absolutely not something that is a coincidence. It has to do with the historical importance of Greece for Europe as the birth of the Western civilization, and the country, which is really struggling now. So by bringing attention from the art community to Athens, it was also a very political statement about this idea of trying for all of us Europeans to remember what Greece means to us as really the birth of democracy, philosophy, the birth of art. And we can see this at the Louvre again today, this morning. I have all these images in my mind. It's really quite fascinating. And I think this is a really great example of a work that speaks to the spirit of the Documenta. So you can all realize that this is the Parthenon. So obviously this has to do a lot with our relationship, the relationship with Athens. But it's also all these little squares are actually the books that have been censored over the years. So this idea was the Parthenon as a sacred place. And remember that the origin of museums is really the treasuries of the Greek temples. That's really the first museum. And the idea that, books, knowledge, building, permanence, eternity, legacy, and the idea that books have been, that some people haven't been able to access knowledge because, they live in places where things are sometimes censored and they haven't been able to be full participant. This was a really interesting work, and as you can tell, this is also a work that is no longer exists anymore. It's taken down after the war, after the event is over, and at that point the only thing we'll probably have is maybe some of the books and maybe some photographs and some videos, but it's really rather ephemeral that way, which is also a great part of art. The real interest that I had in kind of thinking about that talk was the fact that indeed we have been used to a kind of north-south, east and west relationship where very often the east and the south is not considered as an equal partner. But I think now with a much better understanding of the world in general, the rise of numbers of art exhibition, like what we have here. I was thinking also about the Sharjah Biennale, for instance, is really a way for us to reconfigure those cultural roots and thinking about not just that relationship between North and South or East and West or Europe and the United States, but it's actually going to give a sense of independence and a sense of the capacity to actually rethink this cultural world. And I think about, for instance, the Silk Road, which is so important for that region. The idea that, you know, somehow in the north of China, some caravans started going, and then eventually they all ended up in the Gulf, and then eventually some of that materials and goods and knowledge made it back to Europe is really interesting. So think about this idea of using these exhibitions that are popping up everywhere in places that have been sometimes forgotten a little bit by history, and allowing us to think about a dialogue between culture that is very different. This is quite beautiful. And I wanted to talk about, as I wrap up, I wanted to talk about Danvaux as one of these really great marker of the time. So he was invited to work, not the last one, not this charge of Biennale, but the one before. And what was really interesting for me is that at the same time, he also had an exhibition in Paris at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. And I don't know how many of you know who Danvaux is, but few of us know what to deal with and how to deal with. And he uses the Statue of Liberty as the anchor for the discussions about multiculturalism, displacement, exile, and this kind of stuff. So in a way, you can see here, this is a view of the exhibition in Paris. He basically has all these copper plates that replicates the Statue of Liberty that he kind of places in different places for you to engage with and for us to think about what do we need by, what is the meaning of the Statue of Liberty? You know, obviously collaboration, a gift from France to the United States, a kind of a new modern technology, because this was done in a very, very new way. Sculptures were not made like this. Bartholdi really appropriated some of the latest technology, like the Eiffel, like Gustave Eiffel, that kind of, it was nearly more like an engineering feat than anything else. But what is also interesting is that while Danvaux is a good representative of the spirit of the time, he's also someone that, and this is a work by him too, not this is Robert Gerber, but he's also a person that has been important for collectors, and he's been collected. So the capacity for him to navigate different worlds, the world of the Biennale, the world of the collectors, the world of museum, this is at the New Whitney Museum in New York, is very interesting, and it reminds us really that the art world, all the various actors and all the various parts of the art world are connected. You don't have, museums cannot exist without patrons, artists cannot exist without art dealers cannot exist without critics, eventually museum cannot exist with art historian. We're still a little bit useful, and this is really what I think is important. And I want to just conclude by really thinking about how the fair can bring the capacity for a city to develop a sustainable art ecosystem. And from my experience in Abu Dhabi, having been, it's only my second time, but I'm trying to be a really fast learner, I realized that all the ingredients are there. You know, there's projects given to younger artists. There's Chinese artists coming to do gigantic installation. I don't know if some of you remember this last year, where you were all asked to eat a banana and then discard the work. As I was saying, we need to take care of our next generation, involving the students, taking the students from the schools. One of my first Instagram of the fair was when I came yesterday morning, and it was not open to the public, and it was full of children from schools, all of them, you know, sketching, listening, going, and they were all so intensely engaged. And I think this is something that is very unique, because where else are they going to be able to engage with so much contemporary art? I mean, what else can they open their eyes to seeing works that has been made in the four corners of the world. And of course, I mean, being part of this idea of education again, you know, having all these wonderful talks that the fair organized, where we can learn about collectors, where we learned about various places of the world, and it's really, really so important. And of course, behind the fairs, and of course this is from last year, the murals and the street art, which is also a great way to engage with the local community, because public art and street art is really art for the people, and the capacity to actually develop this kind of spaces where artists have a chance to work, but also have a chance to show their work to a wide audience that may never want to go to the museum or be too intimidated to come in the gallery, is really a unique aspect of this. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope that you enjoyed this very, very cursory history of the fairs and the biennales, and I hope that you'll be able to take away how much those events are central to us and to our humanity. And I'll be very happy to take any questions or comments or criticism. I'm game. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's it. Oh, thank you. The brave one. You probably need the microphone.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I'm Valentin. I'm a student here at NYU. Going back to what you were talking about, the different components of the art world, I wanted to ask what are your opinions on the role that the museums are taking nowadays, and how are they facing new challenges, and not even challenges, but what's the interaction between museums and the biennales and the fairs? More specifically, I want to touch upon the concept of global museum, because of course, as we all know, the Louvre coming here, and also the Guggenheim that is also coming here, and how even though these are great and amazing projects, some people might not look at them in such a great light and look at them as being more, let's say, profits-driven or brand-driven, and not so much about the art. So I wanted to know, what are your thoughts on museums today and the future?
Well, how many hours do you have? I think it's actually an entire course. So, but I mean, to try to kind of, in a nutshell, it's going to be really challenging. The museums have been, see, there is a really good word for a curator in English. It's called the keeper. You know, you're the keeper of the work of the Queen, or you're the keeper of the medals and stuff. And that, I think, is a very old-fashioned way to think about museums. The idea that somehow the museums preserve a kind of identity, a national identity. And I think by having the rise of the global museums, such as the Guggenheim and maybe the Louvre, and we're trying to move away from that model, and we're trying to kind of become more inclusive. What struck me at the Louvre today, which is what I start to say at the beginning, is that it's really trying to reform the canon of art history. You know, traditionally when you study art history, you study French art or German art, and then if you even think about the way you encounter the museum, you're going to European painting, or you're going to African art, or you're going to Chinese or Asian art. And I think these new models of the museums are challenging this, are kind of like making us see different things. The money, the economical part of it, I think the right way to think about it is to actually understand it as a necessity. There's no, I mean, art and commerce, art and money, that's always been there. I think a lot of art historians are trying to challenge this and never wanted to actually confront it. But was your question more in terms of the money making for the institution that it is hosting? That's a very complicated question. And I don't know if we have time to. but I think it's ultimately it's how we experience it. So there may be political agenda, there may be economic agenda, but we are the audience. And our role is to kind of put this behind and make the museum ours, to take it, to feel empowered by it, and to not worry too much about this. And I think it's only us, the public, that can move away from this kind of negative criticisms. And I think that's our role. It's our role as the public. We visit the museum, we make it our own, we take our children, we attend the classes, we kind of move away from this criticism. And I think this is the only way we're going to be able to do it. But I was thinking about you as a student. We have to also remember, and most of us don't remember this anymore because there's not much academic training in painting anymore, but museums are essential for artists. If you think about how a lot of artists have met each other, have worked, they were in the museums, you know. Degas, Marie Cassatt, they met at the Louvre. They would copy the old masters. Is this relationship with the past also that's very important. So it's not just that some people can have this kind of criticism saying, well, the Louvre and the Guggenheim, they're coming and they're imposing those Western views onto a different locale. It's how you use the museum. It's how you go as an art student and you start sketching and you start looking at this Chinese head with this Aztec head, and it's going to help you. I mean, I don't know if you study art, or if you're a studio major, but despite all the politics in the back, you still have that chance to go and look at this, and that's what you need to think about it. And I think the rest is let them deal with it. We are the powerful people in here, and the public can change that.
Thank you very much.
That was an intense one. You're welcome. I'm going to be around for a little